They said the ice on Vyerth 12 kept the dead quiet by the weight of a million winters, that nothing spoke beneath those blue slabs but the slow memories of stone. They said the war had ended centuries ago and the ghosts had learned to sleep. They said a lot of things that sounded tidy over tea and treaties. And then the diggers pried a black shape out of the glacier and a human laughed like thunder in a cathedral, and Tidy went out the airlock. The pit buzzed with Dominion scanners and whispered liturgies of preservation as the relic came up, chained in grav lifts. It was a helmet human in form yet massive in presence, the kind of battered steel that seemed to remember all the fists it had met and all the stars it had stared down. Old plasma burns puckered the cheek plate. Someone a lifetime ago had etched a wolf howling into the void where a manufacturer's stamp should have been, and time hadn't managed to sand it away. The Dominion scholars bent close in their silver robes and spoke of harmonic signatures, of myth-made matter of the first destroyer. The human in the parka and cracked visor stepped forward, brushed frost from the visor with a gloved thumb, and exhaled like a man seeing a photo in a box he thought he'd lost. "Oh hell," he said to nobody in particular. "That's Mom's old helmet." Half the Dominion contingent froze outright. Their commander's crest flattened into a shape that in their language meant both alarm and blasphemy. The wind surged, skirling threads of ice dust across the pit. A dozen rifles made that soft collective sound of safeties releasing. The human didn't notice, or he noticed and decided not to care. He set his palm on the temple of the old helm like one might touch the cool stone of a gravestone. He was young by galactic standards, late 20s. Black hair uncooperative beneath the hood, eyes like scorched amber. The name stenciled small on his coat read Kane, Jared. The last name mattered more than any of them knew. The helmet hummed the way a throat might clear after too long quiet. The Dominion's floating lenses shivered and threw back floods of meaningless data. Light walked under the metal in old pathways like dawn rising through veins, and glyphs crawled along the brow in Terran script that resolved into Dominion runes for the trembling benefit of the audience. Authorized personnel detected. CDR, Elena Kane, Legacy Protocol Online. Jared blinked slow. "Hey ma," the air smelled suddenly like hot copper and snow. A voice rose, thin with age and storage corruption but stubborn through both. "Authorization confirmed." "Hello, sweetheart, took you long enough." It was the kind of voice that turned commanders into children. Dominion soldiers knelt by reflex and memory, not their own. The commander said without meaning to, without wanting to test the shape in their mouth, "First destroyer, don't call me that." The voice sharpened. "I've destroyed too much to wear it proud, mostly I built things like a kid." Jared fought the pinch behind his nose. The last time he'd heard that voice had been a recording over a bunk speaker on a backwater frigate on the Terran frontier, a message months late and full of cheer he hadn't trusted. The message had ended with "One day I'll show you the Edda promise," and then war had taken its debts in both directions. The commander found their spine. "Our archives record you as archives embellish," the voice said, and then softened like frost under a weak sun. "Jared, you wore your father's stubbornness like armor and my temper like a blade. You made it to the ice. Good boy." The gravlifts faltered as if the helmet grew heavier with memory. The Dominion scientists hissed to each other in harmonics. Someone unfurled a prayer banner and the wind tore it in half. "Mom," Jared said, forcing his tone casual because anything else would break him open and spill him on this cold floor in front of people he wasn't ready to share with. "You left your stuff everywhere. Galactic littering is a crime." A crackle that might have been laughter. "This isn't litter, this is a lock. Door to what?" He already knew the answer. People often ask questions to give themselves time to breathe. She said, "The long road of it." The helmet's interface flashed like the opening and closing of an eye. The light expanded, drawn into a crude old projector gland along the crown. A woman assembled herself out of photons and grit. She wasn't tall, wasn't armored, wasn't crowned with fire, wasn't anything like the statues the Dominion had erected of their boogamen. She was scarred at the mouth and cheerful in defiance. Her hair was bound in braided cords like a practical map of her head. Her eyes were the color of vacuum seen through cockpit glass. Dominion rifles trembled. Dominion hearts did too. War stories have a way of aging poorly in the presence of those who actually lived them. "Elena Kane," the commander said, and even as they said it, their myth wavered under the pedestrian weight of a first and last name. "You ended the Xylan War. You burned our fleets. I kept a convoy alive," she said. "Everything after that was consequence management, an accident, and rage, mostly rage. Dominion asked me to kneel and I was busy." The wind tried to speak their language and failed. The iceberg's shadow slid across the pit like a sundial's hand. Jared couldn't help it. He stepped closer into the hologram's light and his breath fogged the half-seen cheekbone. "I thought you were gone," she said gently. "Sometimes staying is the crueler trick. Sometimes you have to leave your bones in the ice as a kite string back to the world. Thought you'd been taught that on the frontier by now." "Plenty of strings," he said, "not a lot of kites." She tilted her head the way she always had when she was solving the problem of a machine by listening to what it wasn't saying. "You're thin, food's expensive, eat better. I'll add it to the list." She looked past him at the Dominion gathered on the pit walls and their complications of ritual and metal. "You came to see a god," she said, not unkindly, like a mother explaining grizzly bears to a nervous kid. "You found an exhausted woman. Those two truths aren't as far apart as you think when you're dying. Kneel if you need to kneel, but don't pray, work." The Dominion commander's crest settled slowly back toward a neutral ridge. "We came to learn," they said, and their voice almost meant it. "That's new," she said dryly. "Don't let the habit die, it offends extinction." The ice hummed again deeper, sensors wailed. Beyond the ridge, something screamed in the upper atmosphere like friction itself was in pain. Jared's wrist comm bloomed with interference. The Dominion techs shouted to one another, their tongues knifing the air with consonants. "Someone heard you light the porch lamp," Jared said. The hologram's mouth went a thin line. "Someone always does." She looked left, which in the architecture of the old projector meant north. 2 clicks under the Aurora arch is a hanger throat. You know what's parked. Everything in him that had once been a boy on his mother's cluttered cockpit chair waking to a star's slow turn leaned toward the sound of the Edda's name hidden in that implication. She can't still be alive. Yelena smiled like a wolf glimpsed between trees. "No ship is. Ships only agree to pretend if you love them enough." I left her sleeping. "She'll wake out of stubbornness first and kindness only if you speak right." The commander lifted a cautious hand. "This relic is a cultural artifact we must escort." A thin line of fire stitched across the pit and cut that sentence in half. The first scavenger dropship came in hot and unsubtle. Belly guns chewing a line along the perimeter terraces, scattering Dominion scholars like paper. The drop bay earized and something with too many joints unfolded out of it, metal rope spooling behind like intestine. The sky went from blue to a sickly iron color as cloaks burned off and ships showed their teeth. Out here, news traveled at the speed of greed. Jared put his palm against the helmet once, quick as a kiss goodbye, and slung it up into his arms like it had always belonged there. "We're moving." Dominion rifles found aim again. "Human," the commander said, and there was a new thing in their tone like respect fresh out of the mold, brittle and bright. "We will cover your retreat." "No," Elena said flatly through the projector. "You'll die for a story. I'm not letting you write it." "Opinions noted," Jared said, and then the old habit slid over him, movement in fire, work under pressure. Problem solving with the hands. He climbed the cut steps out of the pit while the first raiders came spidering down their cables. An armored one in orange plates landed before him, almost delicate in the way it absorbed impact. It extended a blade like a memory of a blade. "Relic," it hissed through an external speaker. "Surrender." Jared angled left, let the raiders lunge go a foot wide, and used the momentum to drive his shoulder into the thing's torso. He wasn't strong enough to move it. The ice was. They hit the edge of a frost-slick slab, and the raiders' weight and the slick convergence of frozen layers did the rest. It slid sideways, scrabbling, tried to find purchase on wind-polished glass, failed, and went over into the pit with a clatter that would have rung bells 3 counties over if Vyarth had any bells. Jared did not wait to see it land. The first rule of living through someone else's legend is, don't pause to admire it. The hanger throat presented itself exactly where Elena said. Old doors leaned inward like tired shoulders, their locking bars warped by freeze and thaw. Jared shoved, grunted, shoved again. The doors thought about it. They remembered a human woman with the same jaw and decided to surrender. The Edda slept with her belly in ice and her nose in the long dark. The lights in her ribs were starved animal eyes. She had been a freighter once. You could still see it in the utilitarian lines and in the cargo cushions bolted to the bulkheads that had been patch repaired by someone who knew how to keep worn things working with love and aluminum wire. She had also been at the center of something that had changed how the galaxy told its bedtime stories to its children. If you stood very still, you could hear all the ghosts that weren't there, the ones who'd been saved and the ones who hadn't. She'll be offended you brought company, Yelena said softly. Wait till she sees the bills, Jared said. He carried the helmet up the ramp and into a smell that had been sanctified by oil and sweat and coffee a long time ago. Consoles murmured like a storm rolling uphill. He set the helmet on the captain's chair, and for a strange and fierce second, it was exactly how his life had been before he was old enough to know what missing felt like. The chair with a dent in one arm where a tool had gouged it. The screen with a little dead pixel star like a freckle, and a girl's voice from the galley cursing a grinder. It passed and the ghosts went back to their patient work and the ship remembered it was an artifact. Power her, Elena said. You kept a key. I am the key. He strapped into the co-pilot's couch. His fingers found the muscle memory of toggles he had never actually thrown because some things belong to blood as much as to bone. He flipped the breaker bank. Watched cold lights make hard decisions and choose life. Outside, the hangar doors tallied up incoming threats. The raiders had numbers if not grace. Dominion rifles flickered at the mouth of the throat, bright and insufficient. The Edda groaned the way old houses do in wind. Reactor at 37%, Elena reported, her tone shifting into that professional cadence that had kept so many terrified people calm enough to follow instructions. Thrusters, if you ask. They'll try. Shields are more like polite suggestions. Weapons were memories. We'll make them ambitions, he said. If you die, she said conversationally, I won't forgive you. If I die, you won't have to. Don't be clever, be alive. She slid code slick into the ship's nervous system and found arteries still sure of their maps. The ancient gravitic coils took power like a long drink after work. The Edda shivered like a dog shaking rain and shed a century of frost in a glittering fall. At the throat, a Dominion scholar died in a manner that small children should never have to have explained to them. At the lip, the commander lifted their rifle and put a clean beam through a raider's eye slit and did not look away. Go, Elena said, before we grow fond of them. He nudged the throttle and the Edda slid forward with that impossible grace that ships keep in secret for those they like. Her nose found the winter light. Her hull kissed the edges of the throat and scraped blue sparks. She shouldered the doors open, remembered what sky felt like, and made herself a promise she intended to keep. They hit air and the raiders hit them. The first pass was like diving through bees. Impacts rattled the bones of the ship like a dog on a chain. The cockpit filled with red warnings and with Elena's voice telling each system that it was safe to be brave. Jared flew sloppy to make it look like luck and clean to make it be. He cut under a descending gunboat and felt the heat of its vent wash his canopy. He skimmed a ridge so close ice hummed in the pressure wake. He slid into a gap in the swarm that shouldn't have been there and found it because there always is one if you leave room in your mind for it. You learned. Elena said, almost surprised. Watched a lot of recordings, read every manual you hid under jokes, practiced on garbage scows in rocks with no insurance, didn't die yet. She didn't say I'm proud of you, she didn't have to, her silence was that shape. Big one at 1 o'clock, he said, I see it. Her voice was a knife she kept very sharp and used rarely. You see the way its shield compensators overcorrect at the nose. Like Dad used to oversteer in snow, he said. Don't be sentimental, she said. It's a murder habit. Copy. He rolled the Edda onto her back and climbed hard-nosed toward the faint smear where the high atmosphere thins into meaninglessness. The big raider command barge, fat with stolen armor, came lumbering up to cut him off and present its most terrifying angles to the world. He didn't give it the satisfaction of looking impressed. He cut throttle. Dumped velocity sideways, let gravity and spite do half the work, and dropped. A slate across the barge's bow, so close the paint remembered all the ships that had ever kissed it. He clipped the compensator dome with the Edda's chin, and something inside the raider made the sound of a light bulb realizing truth too late. The nose shields went bright and then dark, and then the rest of the shield grid tried to be in two states at once and achieved neither. That, Elena said mildly, was stupid. It worked. Not the point. He laughed in a way that wasn't healthy, probably, and that was when the sky turned from a problem into a statement. The statement was a Dominion dreadnought slipping down from high orbit like an anvil slid off a shelf. It made a sculptural idea out of dread and then answered a question no one had asked by opening its main spinal gun and pouring a blue lance down into the air. Jared did not have room in his day for religion, so he used the time for math. The math said, run. The heart said, not my back to it. The hand said, fly. On the pit lip, the commander raised their rifle at a threat that could not be affected by a rifle and shouted hoarsely into the command band they did not control. This is a protected site. Cease fire. The dreadnought obliged by not hearing them at all. Elena's voice lost the sarcasm that kept her from crying. Heard the rumor they built another seventh spine. It's not rumor. How good are our shields? Decorative. Showtime then. The Edda was not built to stand in front of a capital ship's attention any more than a human being is built to stand in front of a hurricane. She made a try of it anyway because of history and hatred and because she loved her boy. She slipped into the dreadnought's radar shadow the way a barn swallow tucks into the lee of a barn. She rode the turbulence of the main gun's discharge like a board on a wave and found the place where the wave's violence made a hollow. She put her prow there and knifed through it. The dreadnought fired again and the world dilated to make room for the conversation of energies beyond the comfort of biology. The mountain 100 kilometers away lifted a little off its base and then remembered to put itself down. The aurora in the upper air shivered its skirts. Ice sang. Parts of Jared's brain closed curtains. He flew from the part that always opens the window instead. Mom, he said in a sound like the scraping of two stones. You said the Edda's weapons are memories. They are. Her tone had become someone reading a recipe while the kitchen burned. Specifically of failure. That's a hell of a thing to install. It's the only honest thing. You want to do this, we do it with regret and with love. Her presence reached through the thin space the relic made and touched his hand without touching it. Jared, look at me. He did, and all the horror compacted down into the warmth of her eyes the way a star becomes a white dwarf, stable, dense, dangerous, enduring. I made a thing, she said quietly, I swore I would never use. I left it for you so you could choose. Consent means something even with weapons. "I know," he said. And he was suddenly not a pilot in a cockpit with a galaxy pressing thumbprints into his ship, but a kid under a knit blanket hearing stories of great-grandmothers who walked through bombardments to fetch water and grandfathers who stacked bricks into homes where laughter could live. What's the cost? What it always is. Some of what you think is you will lend to the world. It does not all come back. It will make you more yourself and a stranger to yourself, and you must be kind to the latter because it gave itself on faith. Does it kill us? Only if we mistake the light for permission. He tasted rust. Let's not do that. Then say the word. Outside, the dreadnought turned its hunger toward the pit where the helmet had come from, because empires, when confronted with a thing that frightens them, eat the place it came from if they cannot eat the thing itself. Dominion scholars who had dedicated their lives to studying the lineaged artifacts of a polite civilization that had never existed found themselves making choices with their bodies very fast with no footnotes. The commander, who had entered this pit to take custody of a relic and had instead been handed the job of learning in public, stepped between the nearest raider and a technician and fired until their rifle hissed empty and then used it to hit a face. It was not elegant science. It was still science, testing hypotheses about what worked to keep one other living being alive in the next second. "Say it," Elena whispered. "Family emergency," Jared said, and the relic understood the ancestral joke and consent and the memory of a woman sealing a door with her bare hands while fire tried to come through and opened. The ship filled with light, but not the kind that blinds. It was the light of seeing what you love arranged on a table after you thought it lost. It was the light of late afternoon in a yard where the laughter you have earned is happening off to your left. It was the light of blue earth from low orbit when you're alone and you let yourself believe there is a world where people plant tomatoes and argue about dumb TV shows. It was simply the light of enough. Systems that had been numbers on a screen became fingers, tendons, breath. The ship made a choice about being a body. Elena's mind, which had been smeared thin over channels and accesses and forgotten caches of code, condensed and stepped forward into the cockpit as if taking a step through a doorway she had once mortared herself. The seat beside Jared dipped though nothing touched it. She turned her palms up in the air like a fighter asking fate for one more dance. They moved as one. The Edda uncurled from her torque and came up under the dreadnought's belly into a canyon of armor and arrogance where no ship with a sense of its own mortality would loiter. Jared flew her there because sometimes you have to show the universe that your fear is not your master. Only your Dr. Elena laid a hand on the pulse of the gravitic coils and asked them to remember one particular moment. The one where she had failed to save a refugee barge and had sworn that if a day came when a trade had to be made between a promise and a rule, she would pay the price. The coils warbled. The ship sang like forged steel cooling. Space flexed like a muscle under strain. The Edda's new old weapon woke. It was not a gun, not exactly. It was a refusal given shape. It gathered the ship's griefs and lined them up like soldiers told gently that this was what their training had been for, that they were going to protect people now, that nothing else had ever been worth the practice. It compressed the gravity in a small part of the dreadnought's belly until the equations admitted that they had always wanted to be simpler, and then when simplicity was a flat sheet, it let it spring back into complexity at a speed that made metaphor sweat. The result walked through the dreadnought slowly and with great care to avoid killing more than it must, which is to say it failed in a manner that still saved lives. The dreadnought did not explode so much as it remembered not to be one piece. The spinal gun spiked and melted, and the shield grid tried one last time to be both on and merciful, and thus was neither. The ship exhaled in 3 major sections. Compartments that had been designed to keep vacuum out did a very creditable job of keeping it in, which is to say, again, many people lived and many did not, and there is no math for the difference between those two numbers that quiets your head at night. Jared cried once with his mouth closed and his eyes open because he had flown a knife into a thing built by somebody's parent for somebody's child to feel safe in, and he had cut it open and he had done it to save lives, and these are not contradictions that undo each other. They stack. You carry them. You do not set them down because you might need the weight to keep you from being blown into stupidity later. On the ground, the raiders broke all at once. The way flocks do when the hawk strikes the lead. The Dominion line did not pursue. They sagged relit banners with shaking hands, bandaged ears that had been too close to what had just happened, and looked up. "Good hit," Elena said hoarsely. "Not good enough," he said. "No such thing," she said fiercely. "We are not perfectionists. We are endurance animals. We do what we can until we sleep." The dreadnought's surviving halves tried to bring secondaries to bear. Fires walked those decks like surgeons trying to decide where to cut. Signals leaped and died. Somewhere in there, a commander who had gone to all the right schools tried to make all the right decisions and learned what all commanders learn, which is that the decisions you make are not the ones you trained for, but the ones given to the body in front of you by the world in this moment. The Edda ran out of kindnesses to offer herself. Her coils glowed in a way that made engineers write poetry to make the math bearable. Her reactor asked for quarter. Jared's hands shook on the drives. Elena's voice went quiet because she was busy living inside the power grid with who she was. Mom, he said, and there were 1,000 things in the word all at once. Thanks, I'm tired. Are you here? Don't leave. I see you. I'm ready. I'm not ready. I missed you. You made me. I hear you, she said. Hold steady. I'm going to open the thing wide enough to walk away. You'll be less and also more. That's the trick. You'll learn it too. We all do if we're lucky enough to be asked to do something we can't do and then do it anyway. He laughed once at the cruelty and kindness braided in that sentence and put the Edda's nose toward a slice of sky that looked thin enough to cut and strong enough to bear weight. The Relic thrummed in sympathy with the hull, with the boy, with the mother. Down below. The Dominion commander put a hand on the pit wall. They did not pray. They counted the living. They sent teams. They told the scavenger survivors that if they put their weapons down this second they would live to make better decisions later, and to their startled credit some did. The commander looked up again and said softly to the air and to the ice and perhaps to the memory of the myths in their grandmother's bedtime voice, "She was not a destroyer, she is a mother." The Edda bit into the thin sky and the thin sky bent and did not break. The dreadnoughts' halves rolled like great beasts in pain and then went still. The raiders scattered into trajectories that meant poverty and perhaps a year later honest work. In the cockpit, Jared sat very still and felt the pieces of himself that had loaned themselves to the ship come home slow like kids after curfew in ones and twos. Some did not. He left a porch light on for them anyway. Elena looked at him for a long time without speaking. He watched her edges fuzz the way a holograms do when the emitter is hot. He thought of all the goodbyes he had not said right in his life and how maybe there are none said right, only said. Mom, he said. Jared, she said. Something in the way she said his name put him back in a kitchen where a plant struggled in a window, and the hum of a cheaper ship's drives pooled like warm water in the walls. Does it? Do you go now? I go everywhere, she said, which was both the promise and the cruelty of the Relic. I left parts and stones and ports and vending machines in the hands of people who didn't know they were holding me. I became the fertility of the world, like we used to say about ash after the fire. I'll be in every jury rig that works when it shouldn't, in every kid who figures out a way around a rule that isn't kind, in every old wrench that's kept not because it's the best tool but because it fits your hand when you're scared. That's the weapon I built. That's what the Dominion feared, not the blast, the culture. He swallowed. You could lie to me now and I'd believe you. She smiled. I never did learn how. Stay, he said. Can't, she said, but I can linger until you don't need me to. I'll always SHH. She touched his cheek without touching it. Needing me and needing the idea of me are different. The idea is cheap. I'll leave that, the rest you'll make yourself. You'll find a kid somewhere who looks like you did when you were listening to the engines like they were gods, and you'll hand them a piece of metal and tell them to learn the sound of their own hands. That's how we live forever, not with statues, with muscle memory. He nodded because if he opened his mouth he would say something he couldn't survive hearing himself say. They banked down out of the thin sky and back toward the pit because you always go back to where you took something from to see if you can return something else in trade. The Edda put her shadow across the excavation and the Dominion did not run. They lifted their faces like flowers. The commander's crest made the small tilt that meant a thing no longer needed to be argued. Jared found the landing thrusters that still remembered their own names and placed the ship like a mother lays a sleeping child into a bed that isn't theirs. He stood up on legs that would complain about stairs tomorrow. He took the helmet because some objects have opinions if you don't, and climbed back out into the wind. The commander met him in the doorway like the old ways were finding new forms. Their hand hovered and then, with the careful courage of people who had once only touched sacred things with tools, they laid their palm lightly on the helmet. I believed in stories, they said, that were told to make me afraid. Today I learned to believe in work I can do. He wanted to hug them. It didn't fit the moment. He nodded. You kept people alive. I became a person who did that, they said. I did not know I could be that person before lunch. Most of us don't, he said. Will you leave the Relic? The commander asked, and the way they asked made what could have been demand into humble question. He looked down at the old steel, at the wolf's howl etched shallow and unerasable. He thought about ownership and about use and about the shaped luck of history. He tried to imagine this helmet sitting behind a museum's glass, and the ache in his chest told him that was the wrong story. He tried to imagine the helmet disappearing into a Terran black facility and becoming a lever applied to a fulcrum no one voted for. That was a wrong story too. He imagined it held by no one and everyone, tuned to wake when a hand touched it with intent to build more than break. It's not a crown, he said. It's a tool. Tools belong to hands that will use them right. You each have to decide what that means, and that decision'll keep you up nights. Good. The commander's crest tilted again, meaning accepted. Elena murmured in his ear as the wind found a new octave. You know what to do with the rest of me. He did. He walked to the lip of the pit where the ice had grown thin from all the attention of ships and guns and gods, and he knelt. He laid the helmet down into the cradle of cold and let go. The ice took it back with a sound like the word yes. The light around the pit changed. The aurora leaned down as if curious. The relic no longer hummed, or it hummed at a frequency only the patient could hear. Either way, the myth reburied itself with a little smile on its face. He stood there for a time while the Dominion began the work that always happens after a story. The work of inventory, of bandages, of lists, of arguments about jurisdiction, and then decisions to ignore those arguments because people needed soup more than signatures. The raider survivors, stripped of weapons and pretense, carried crates and stared at their hands like they were new. The sky remembered how to be sky. Ready? Elena said softly. I don't know what that means, he said. Correct, she said, approving as ever when he gave an honest wrong answer. It means we go anyway. He climbed back into the Edda and the ship made room for him like a bed that remembers your weight. He strapped in and took a slow breath. He looked at the place where his mother's presence glowed faint beside him and then at the blank they had agreed to leave there when she went. He nodded to both. They lifted on thrusters that coughed and then smoothed out the way old smokers clear their throats for a song. The Dominion waved, timid at first, then like they were practicing a language, fervent. The commander stood very straight and did not salute because they didn't have that motion in their culture but invented something like it on the spot, palm to chest, then out, a gift and a promise. He returned it without thinking. These gestures travel well, they climbed. Vyerth 12 fell away into a plate of blue-white scored by the long gray veins of the digworks and the coffin-black oblongs of the dead ships that had been forgotten in the ice because forgetting makes life possible sometimes. The wind became less of a person and more of a phenomenon. The clouds pulled back like curtains. At the edge of air, Jared turned the Edda's nose toward the high, cold, honest dark and Aleph vector. He had a place in mind, nothing urgent, nothing strategic, just a rock where a friend had once traded him stories for fuel. Those are the important coordinates. Mom, he said. Yes. If I don't hear you on the next jump, you will, she said, and then to be kind added. If you listen. He smiled because she knew exactly where to put the knife, so it cut him open and took the thing that needed to come out and left the rest intact. He set his hands on the throttles and felt them become part of him again, not extensions, not prison bars, the world through which he would move. He jumped. The Edda was a knife through cloth. The cloth was a map of everything anyone had ever tried to say about themselves. Space shuddered the way a body does when a remembered pain passes by and doesn't stop. The ship asked for more from him and he gave it and then asked for more and he kept some for tomorrow because love without boundaries isn't love, it's fire. They came out into the night near a gas giant the color of the inside of a bruise. The ring system made a hymn around it out of gravel. The local star did not inquire who they were. He likes stars for that. They don't care in a way that makes room for you to care without competition. He cut engines to a whisper and let momentum write the next line. Elena did not speak. Somewhere in the ship a panel popped back into place as if embarrassed to have been rattled loose in front of guests. He laughed once with relief bleeding into it. When he finally slept, it was with the chair tilted and a blanket he had no memory of placing over him. He woke to coffee. He didn't drink coffee. He drank it because some concessions to ritual are owed. Elena's voice returned as if aboard with a bag of groceries, not like a deity with edicts. You keep doing that and you'll like coffee. Nobody likes coffee, he said automatically, and their argument resumed like a long conversation paused only because someone's commute had ended. News would travel, had already left Vyerth on all the wrong ships, but news is a strangely fragile thing. By the time it reached the Dominion capital, the story would have the edges smoothed off and the wrong parts emphasized, and the myth reasserted itself with new jewelry. The important news would travel slower, in hands and habits, in the way the commander would step between a weapon and a technician without waiting to be asked, in the way a raider would find themselves a year hence, fixing a water recycler on a poor moon with the careful tenderness of someone who has seen what breaks and believes in repair as a sacrament. Jared and the Edda became a rumor useful to good people and a problem for those who wanted the galaxy to be simpler than it is. He took jobs that felt like they were worth the effort and refused the ones that needed him to pretend they were. He kept the coils cool. He taught a kid on a dry station to listen to a pump for the song that meant a bearing was about to give up. He delivered cheap medicine to a place whose name the wealthier planets liked to mispronounce because it kept their appetites comfortable. He patched a dome with a tarp and a joke and an apologetic prayer to whoever did air math out here, and it held long enough to matter. He avoided fleets and flags. He sent his mother into vending machines and the hands of nurses, as promised. Sometimes, late in a transit when the only thing moving was the hum at the back of his teeth and the faint glitter of cosmic rays like distant campfires, he would hear her inhale like she was about to say something important and then not say anything at all. He learned that those breaths meant, say it yourself. He did. He said thank you to no one, and the ship accepted it anyway. Twice he encountered Dominion detachments who wanted the relic. Twice he put the Edda between them and whoever they were trying to scare and made himself big. He used the weapon once more with care and apology, and the other time he didn't need to because he told the story first and it did enough of the work. The commander from the ice sent a message on a secured band he did not know they had access to, consisting of 3 words, "Still learning." He replied with 2, "So am I." He dreamed sometimes of Earth, though he had never lived there. Which is how Earth prefers to do its work in the hearts of those out too far, as a promise you keep to strangers. In those dreams, his mother was at a sink doing something with her hands that made soap smell like godliness, and her hair had gone entirely gray and she didn't apologize for it. He would wake up calm and the Edda would murmur like a dog at the foot of the bed. Once, on a rescued freighter full of cold, sick children, a little girl reached out and patted the Edda's wall as if it were the flank of a pony. "Good ship," she said gravely. Later, when the freighter was safe and the passengers had discovered the particular wrong taste of relief tears, Jared went back into the corridor and patted the same patch of wall and echoed the judgment. The ship kicked a relay as if embarrassed. The place between stars is large enough that you can tuck a life into its corners if you're careful and keep your head down and your heart up. He did both. He and Aelina argued amiably about whether tea counted as fuel. He sent money when he had it to places that did something useful with it, and when money wasn't the thing needed, he sent himself and his hands. He destroyed less than he repaired and repaired more than he admired, and sometimes he sat in the dark and let the weight in his chest be heavy without telling it to stop. Years have a way of being sneaky when you live in the clockless places. They piled gently on his shoulders. His hair went a little silver at the edges. The freckle on the dead pixel drifted a millimeter to the left because entropy insists on small jokes. He added a line with a soldering iron to the wolf on the helmet the day he saw it again and put the iron down and cried because grief keeps a calendar you don't get to see. He visited Vyarth 12 when Momentum and Map said it was time, and Aelina said nothing because she had learned too that there are places where words don't help. The pit had become a campus of sorts. Low buildings with strong roofs. Banners that indicated not prayers but the direction to hot meals. A field where kids in Dominion crests and in the mismatched badges of Raider families, now Allied, played a game that involved hitting a ring with a ball until everyone fell down laughing. The commander wave saluted and he wave saluted back, and they spoke for an hour about logistics and never once about worship. The helmet rested under ice that had learned how to hold a thing with gentleness. He put his hand on the ice and it was like putting his hand on an old friend's grave in spring sunlight. If there was an answer in the cold, he didn't need it. The question had become his companion. That was enough. Before he left, a young scholar with a crest still soft from adolescence ran up to him, skidded, nearly fell, bowed, and thrust a drawing into his hands. A child's sketch of a ship with a smiling face and a small figure at the window. He said thank you like it was to the universe again and tucked the drawing under a panel where he kept things that made parts of him ache in a good way. On the day it happened, there is always a day it happens. He was at a listening post rebuilt from a smuggler den, arguing half-heartedly with a cook about whether you can ruin an egg if you don't hurry it, when a Dominion courier came in with a face white as printer paper and breath like it belonged in the emergency room. "War," they said, and then corrected out of respect for words. "A knife, in the dark, someone wants to wake the old myths." The knife had a flag unfamiliar to everyone in the room and a hunger unambiguous. It measured the spaces where the Dominion was unsure and put its fingers there hard, the way abusers do in relationships. Chips fell, people fell. Broadcasts arrived with the stale echo of propaganda. The phrase "first destroyer" rose out of the ice again as if dragged by a fishing line on the end of a cynic's hook. Aelina whispered no, not because she didn't want to be called. She was mother enough to answer the wrong name if it meant a child in a crowd found a hand, but because she understood that if she came in like a god in a crisis, the habit would never break. She said to Jared, quietly, cleverly, stubbornly, "Tools, not trumpets, kitchens, not thrones." He nodded. The Edda did not roar out of dock. She eased into the dark like a burglar in slippers. He called 5 people he trusted and asked them to call 5 more until somewhere across a scatter of underfunded stations and old farms you could hear a web being strung. They moved grain. They moved parts. They moved the idea that you don't have to like the Dominion to keep the Dominion alive when something worse knocks. They moved the idea that a human with a wrench and a smile is sometimes the fear of those who built their empires on the assumption that everyone would behave. The knife did not know what to do with this. It tried to cut faces. It found hands. It tried to slice symbols. It found places where symbols had been hung on nails because people were busy. It tried to pull the first destroyer out of a hat and found, instead, 1,000 people willing to stand in doorways with mops and prevent a flood. There were battles. He was in a few. He chose his shots. He bled when the math said bleed. He held fire when the math said hold. He once sat on his hands to keep them from deciding without permission. The weapon woke only once more and then slept because a sleeping weapon is a lullaby that makes for better dreams. On the night the knife became a handle that they could grip and turn so its own weight took it out of the door, the Edda hung at the edge of a gas refinery turned triage ward and he and Elena watched tired people sit on crates and discover they still had jokes left. A child chased a drone with a spoon. The commander from Vyerth came up on the band and said, "We have food enough. If you have people, send them. If you don't, send this message to someone who does." He did. "Messages are what we are." "Mom," he said, "yes, you think there's an end to this?" "No," she said, "there's only the next patch and the next loaf of bread and the next kid you point to a safe chair and the next thing you build when something you loved is broken." "Good," he said and meant it, and they both laughed at the bleak comfort of that. They drifted out away from the refinery to let the ward breathe, and he cut the lights and looked at the slow turn of everything. Somewhere, a ventilator sang its fragile song to a bed, and someone's granddaughter brought a deck of cards into a room where the news mentioned war, and then did not mention it for an hour while the game happened. The Edda's hull ticked as heat left in search of equilibrium. He leaned his head back and found the spot where the cushion had given up pretending to be anything other than the shape of a skull. He closed his eyes and saw the wolf etched on the helmet, and the way the line he had added had thickened over the years like a scar on a knuckle. He thought about the first time he'd laid his palm on that cold old steel and said something foolish and loving to a dead woman who had refused to take yes for an answer from mortality. He thought about how the Dominion commander had lifted their palm to their chest and then out, and how that motion had begun to show up in other places. Uncredited, which is how you know a thing lives. He thought about a girl on a freighter patting a wall and saying good ship, and about eggs and about coffee and about grief calendars. "Hey," he said softly into the dark. "Hey," Elena answered, "thanks for the helmet, thanks for the hands." He slept then truly like a soldier in peacetime and a mechanic after a long day, fully without bargaining. In the morning, which in space is whenever someone with a job says it is. He woke and moved and turned the ship toward a place that needed an extra pair of hands because the list never ends and because neither did his ability to write his name on it again and again. The Edda thrummed and the Relic hummed and the world rolled up its sleeves. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.